In the South, not everyone supported secession. Some Southerners remained pro-Union and refused to support the Confederacy, although they did form a pretty tiny minority, probably under 2%. The most pro-Union and anti-Confederate areas of the South tended to be in the Appalachian Mountains, where the poor whites of West Virginia, Western North Carolina, and Eastern Tennessee tended to see the war as a war for slavery, which of course it was not, but Americans could oversimplify back then as easy as they can now. So, the Confederates had a hard time maintaining order in those areas, and it generally wasn't too safe for them to go up there to collect taxes or enforce the draft. In Western Virginia, things got so bad that the people opposed the secession of Virginia, so that they and the people then in what became West Virginia, these small counties, separated from West Virginia. So Virginia left the Union, then several dozen western counties of Virginia separated from Virginia and clung to the Union. In 1863, this western area was admitted to the Union as the state of West Virginia. There was a little bit of controversy over the constitutionality of it, and it took actually until the 1920s for the Supreme Court to sort it all out, but West Virginia remains a separate state now. So, obviously, there was some resistance to the war in both the North and the South, but the majority of people in both sections supported their section's causes. However, in both the Union and the Confederate armies, you could find regiments from Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland, so that shows divisions. Put it this way, you couldn't find any Pennsylvania or New York regiments in the Confederate Army, and you couldn't find any white Georgia or Texas regiments in the Union Army, but you could find Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland regiments on both sides, so the war truly was brother versus brother in those states. Families literally split, with some fighting in the North and some fighting for the South. In fact, there are stories, known cases of brothers capturing or fighting each other on various battlefields of the war. So it's these border states, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, which caused the biggest headache for Lincoln in many ways. Not only were they the group, the cluster of states with the strongest internal divisions, but they also tended to be good manufacturing states, especially Missouri. So it was very important to keep them part of the Union, as well as it was key to keep Maryland part of the Union, because as you see there, Washington, D.C. sits right smack dab on the Potomac, Maryland on one side, Virginia on the other. You can't exactly have the nation's capital in the Confederacy. So what Lincoln did were two very controversial moves, having to do with the writ of habeas corpus and martial law. So the writ of habeas corpus, as you guys know, it's the right to know your charges, otherwise you have to be released. And martial law, which is basically a military government. This is when the military goes in, takes over the local government, and usually includes suspension of civil liberties, such as freedom of speech and freedom of the press. So Lincoln says that he has to save the Constitution, in order to save the Constitution, he has to break the Constitution, and he has to keep those border states. So he starts first by suspending the writ of habeas corpus in just the border states, and then in 1862 imposed martial law on the entire nation. So in other words, everyone is going to have some suspensions. In 1861, it went to the Supreme Court, and the ruling of Taney's Supreme Court said actually only Congress had the right to suspend habeas corpus. But in 1863, Congress retroactively approved Lincoln's suspension. And then after the war, we're going to get another one of these cases called Ex parte Milligan in 1866, saying that martial law may not be applied to civilians in areas where there is no insurrection and where civilian courts are still open. So please right now go to your Supreme Court's case sheet and take a careful, close look at these cases. Write down any questions that you may have. So this is really Lincoln's darker legacy? This is the question of, was this his big bonehead mistake? So was he right to impose martial law? Was he right to suspend the writ of habeas corpus? So I'd like you guys right now to open up this article on Lincoln, read it, and answer the questions. It can be very brief. Hang on to this for when we return, and we're going to talk about it the first day back. Please do not upload it to Canvas. I will check homework in class instead. So with the mobilization of so many men, Northern and Southern women picked up the slack, taking up much of the farm work in both areas. Remember, most Americans, North and South, were mostly farmers at this time. And also, at this time, women are going to become nurses in both the North and the South. Up until this time, it was quote-unquote improper for women to serve as nurses because nurses have to touch their patients. Scandal! However, Northern women such as Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, remember her, Dorothea Dix, remember her, and Clara Barton, are going to point out that women could do the nursing, and that would free up more men to fight, and that ended up being a very persuasive argument. Southern women made the same argument, and therefore during the Civil War, nursing is going to become an acceptable quote-unquote career for women. Today, as you know, nursing does remain a female-dominated profession, although of course male nurses become more common all the time. The fact, though, that women are going to become nurses was a step forward for women and women's rights. Although it did come in an unusual way, nobody was like, let's have women become nurses because this will allow women to make it in another profession and this will advance our cause after the war. So even though nobody said that, this was nonetheless the effect. Wars always disrupt the social fabric, and disruption can bring change. So this is a good example of that. So, to conclude, we can see how the two sides compared when the war began and some of what had to be done to fight the war. The North's advantages proved decisive in the long run, but we know things could have turned out differently. Of course, there was no guarantee of victory just because the North had so many advantages. Remember, the British seemed to have all the advantages before the American Revolution, but they didn't win, and the same thing could have happened in the Civil War. There was no denying, though, that the war required an unprecedented amount of mobilization in American manpower and women power and resources on both sides. There will also be some Northerners who had some unhappy men drafted into the Army, and while the draft did have some unfairness, most soldiers volunteered, and this is the case for Southerners too. The big Northern advantage, of course, came in sheer numbers, as noted. The North had that manpower advantage of a little over 4-to-1. The vast majority of people in both sections supported their sections. However, in both the Union and the Confederate armies, you could still find regiments from Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland, showing that brother versus brother mentality. The attitude on both sides then, in the beginning of the war, was that one battle would end the entire war. Both sides were extremely confident for victory. The first battle is going to take place July of 1861. This is called the First Battle of Manassas, or the First Battle of Bull Run. Most battles have two names. The Confederates had moved their capital to Richmond, Virginia, and we thought that if we just grabbed Richmond, we would win. Basically, we had two very badly trained armies going to fight each other, and the South actually wins this battle. It's actually in some ways a good thing that the North lost because we learned a lot more from losing. The South thinks, though, that they are the best. The North decided to rethink their tactics, and they decided that they needed a plan. They needed a plan for a really long struggle. In fact, our struggle is going to be long, and it's going to be very broad. The farthest western battle was in Arizona. The Union General-in-Chief at that time was Winfield Scott, and he proposed the Anaconda Plan. This was to seize control of the Mississippi Valley and the Mississippi River and then squeeze control of the South. Just like an anaconda snake, they would squeeze the South and basically bleed it dry. The advantage was that the South had most of the rivers that ran along the North and the South. So they had the Mississippi, and the North was using steamships. The technology, though, in the North was good, and we're going to have armored warships, and the railroads are going to be critical, all of which is going to work in our advantage of splitting the South and having a northern advantage. However, even though the North had this plan, this Anaconda plan, it was going to take time for us to organize our advantages. And for instance, we had the leader, McClellan. George McClellan was the head general, who was a really kind of cocky jerk who treated Lincoln very disrespectfully. But Lincoln decided, hey, I'm going to let it go because I've got to win the war. But it was those little things like that that are going to set the North back a bit. Also, the fact that we were going up against Robert E. Lee is not going to make it easy. So Ulysses S. Grant is actually going to start to get some attention in 1862, and at the same time Lee is going to launch his first assault in the North. Robert E. Lee actually decided that the South had to win an offensive battle on Northern territory. He understood that a big battle win he was seeing this now as a foreign territory would look really good, and maybe it would help the South get some outside help. He's thinking of it like maybe it's like the Battle of Saratoga in the Revolution. So Lee is going to invade Maryland in 1862. In the North, this is going to actually be a big break for us. Lee's secret plan was actually discovered by Union troops and then given to McClellan, who was an idiot and not a very good battlefield general. It was his golden opportunity to strike at Lee, and it really could have shortened the war, but McClellan was overly cautious and completely paralyzed. September 17, 1862, the two armies came together at Antietam Creek, which ran through the battlefield. It was a one-day battle, and it was fought with over 100,000 troops on each side. It was the bloodiest day of the Civil War, where we're going to have the Union 12,500 casualties versus the Confederate 13,700 casualties. Very bloody, and the bodies were very thick. That's actually a photo from the Battle of Antietam. Photography was just getting started back then. This was actually a small defeat for the South. Lee retreated back into Virginia, and the Union claimed it as a victory, although it could have been a much bigger victory. Lincoln now began to move towards the Emancipation Proclamation. He had been avoiding slavery as an issue, but Lincoln was hoping that something would happen that would end up freeing the slaves. Lincoln was reluctant to do anything about slavery, so it wouldn't look like a desperate move so he needed a Union victory. And after this battle, Lincoln will issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation that would go into effect January 1st, 1863. So I'd like you guys to take a minute and watch this brief history of the Battle of Antietam, and we're going to pick up there in class when we return. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for listening. See you soon.